There comes a time for everyone when you've got to start dealing with really difficult financial issues. One of the issues that I deal with a lot in my office is a widow who comes in and she says, Doug, my husband has been handling the money for the past 45 years, and all of a sudden I feel so alone. I've got everything to do. I'm a smart woman. I know how to deal with money, but I just haven't dealt with the investments. I haven't dealt with the day-to-day operations. And really now, I'm just afraid what's going to happen to me. Can you help me out? So what I want to do is I want to talk to you today about some very difficult issues that people have related to widowhood, related to inheritances, related to charity, related to giving to people, or finding people who maybe want to take from you a little too much. That's the topic for today's conversation. If you have any specific questions about your own situation, you can feel free to contact me in Israel. My email address is doug@profile-financial.com, or you can go to the website, profile-financial.com, or simply call the office in Jerusalem, 02-624-2788. Now, widowhood is a very, very difficult time for anyone. There's such a change in your life, not only emotionally, but all of a sudden financially things change. A lot of times people have been getting a pension, and all of a sudden that stops. Or now they get the spouse's pension, but the spouse's pension may only be 50% or 60 or 70% of what the couple was earning. And the reason that is they say, well, listen, if the husband's no longer around, so you don't need the full 100%. Well, maybe, but maybe your lifestyle is just different. There is no cookie-cutter approach to handling the finances, so each person really has to look at her own situation in her own financial plan. One of the problems that people end up with a lot is right after a spouse passes away, they have no access to money. What happens if the brokerage firm or the bank says, oh, well, you had a joint account, or sometimes the account was in your husband's name, and you don't have access to the money? To plan for that in advance, of course, you want to make sure that you have accounts that are in joint name that will allow you to access the money immediately, or that you have a debit card or a checkbook, or perhaps you should each have your own individual account. It's not a philosophy to have individual accounts and say, oh no, my husband and I don't share things. No, that's not what having an individual account means. An individual account means you simply have access to your money. But the other thing is in terms of investments. You want to make sure that the investments you have are actually liquid. If you have investments that are in real estate or in the family business or simply not tradable, what are you going to do? If you need cash, you simply cannot say, well, we own this rental apartment. I think I'll sell the living room and that'll give me $400,000. It doesn't work that way. There are different types of investments, and some of them are liquid and some of them aren't. I actually spoke to a woman recently who had millions and millions and millions of dollars in real estate. Interestingly, this real estate did not produce a lot of income. So she was wealthy for sure, but she just didn't have access to the money. So the solution to dealing with the problem of not having access to your money is make sure your accounts have the correct name on them, and make sure you have investments that are liquid, or at least a portion of them are liquid, to allow you immediate access to your money whenever you'll need it. All right, let's look at another problem. Once you have a lot of money, all of a sudden people start to show up. Maybe you've noticed that in the past. Certainly there are cases when a spouse dies and all of a sudden the widow's left with all this money and she doesn't know what to do, and a salesman comes knocking at the door. Hello, ma'am, let me help you out. I'll help you with your investments. Or a family member comes along and says, your husband had promised me that he would help me to invest in my new business. You want to make good on that promise, don't you? Or maybe friends come along, and certainly charities are looking to see who might be in a position now to give some money. So here's the solution. You don't have to make the decision. Certainly you don't have to make it immediately. And the best way to handle it, I find, for people who sometimes don't want to say no, or maybe they're tempted to say yes, but they're not sure of the safety of saying yes, is just simply say to the person, I don't know. I need to check with my financial advisor. Call me next week. Next problem. What do you do with your money now? What happens when you receive this money and maybe it's in a brokerage account with a lot of stocks, or maybe it's an IRA and there are mutual funds, maybe there are exchange traded funds or index funds or properties, and maybe you don't even know what some of these words are or why your spouse invested in them in the first place. What's the first thing to do? If there is nothing urgent that needs to be done. For example, urgent would mean, let's say your husband had invested a lot of money in one stock. Well, that is a huge risk. That's something you should right away go to the financial advisor and deal with. But I don't want people to have to deal with the minutia of mutual funds or stocks or exchange traded funds or anything to do with money when they're dealing with the emotional tragedy of losing someone. So ideally, first and foremost, do nothing. The next thing you want to do is to begin to prepare a detailed inventory. Now, this might be easier said than done. You've got to find all of the bank accounts, all of the brokerage accounts, all of the IRAs, the 401ks, the pensions. Figure out what you got. That's the first step. Next is examine any income you have versus any outflow. How much money actually is coming in either from pensions or from work or from dividends and interest, and at the same time see how much money you have to spend. The next thing you want to do is to begin to prioritize what are your obligations. These can generally be distinguished in two categories, the wants and the needs. The needs are obviously the most important. Do you have food on the table, a roof over your head, a shirt on your back? Those are the needs. The wants, however, are going to be things like, well, I want to help my kids out, or I want to take a vacation, or I want to buy something new, or I want to move. Prioritize what's important to you. By having these priorities, that makes the next step so much easier. The next step is creating a financial plan. Financial plan is basically a long-term cash flow analysis. That means, do you have enough money coming in every month to pay the bills going out every month? You can't figure that out unless you know what your obligations are. You can't figure that out unless you know what your monthly income is. You're going to need that information. So start now by preparing and gathering all this information. Look at your income, look at your priorities, create the financial plan, and of course, most importantly, is stick to the plan. Once you build the investments and you have your strategy for how much money you're going to spend, what your budget is going to look like, now's the time to actually stick with it. It's very difficult for people who haven't been doing this their whole life. It is certainly reasonable to sit down with someone, a financial coach, a financial advisor, a financial planner, and say, listen, can you just help me to keep tabs to make sure that I'm keeping up with what I said I was going to do, because I don't want to discover that in 3 or 5 or 10 years, all of a sudden I'm out of money and I didn't realize it happening as I was going along. Let's talk about inheritances a little bit more. Inheritances have their own problems associated. For example, let's say that your spouse was handling the investments and maybe he was very good at it, and he leaves you a portfolio of investments that you don't understand. Well, the first thing you need to do is to figure out, like we said earlier, what are your wants and needs? Do you even need to have all these investments? Do you need a complicated portfolio? Or would it be just as easy for you to have money in bank deposits or maybe some simple bonds that just pay you interest every year and you live off the interest and you can be satisfied with that? Next is you want to figure out how much risk is reasonable for you, both from a financial standpoint and from an emotional standpoint. And a great way to consider your own tolerance for risk is to say to yourself, let's say, for example, your portfolio is worth $1 million. Say to yourself, well, given the portfolios in the stock market, let's say it crashes again like it did in 2008, and it drops by $400,000. Wow, what would I do? If you find yourself having a heart attack just thinking of that question, maybe you don't have the tolerance for risk to have so much money in the stock market. And that's okay. That just means you've got to change the portfolio. On the other hand, if your gut reaction is to say, well, I believe in the stock market, and if the market were to drop, I wouldn't just sell everything out, I would hold on, and I know that I have enough money on the side or enough money coming in from pensions to cover my monthly expenses, so I consider myself a long-term investor even though I'm already retired. That is considered your tolerance for risk. That's a great discussion to have with friends, family, financial advisors to really determine how much risk you can stand. Finally, rebuild the portfolio to fit your new reality. Things might have been different when your husband was handling it. Now, if you are a widow and you have different cash flow needs, you have different tolerance for risk, you don't want to follow it, you don't like the stock market, all that's fine. It's time to rebuild a portfolio to make sense for who you are. Another problem that people have is you want to help your children with the money that you have, and there's really a problem for a lot of people, because if you haven't built in helping your children into the budget, you might find that it's a big surprise. It's one thing to every so often you give your kids $100 for a birthday present. It's another thing to say, well, I'm going to help them pay their rent, or I will pay their rent, and I have 4 kids and 9 grandchildren, and I'll pay everyone's rent. Well, you can't do that, or you decide to pay everyone's tuition. If you don't plan for it, you're not going to know if you're able to do it, and if you do plan for it, you might discover that you don't have enough money. Heck, you might discover you do have enough money. But by helping people out or making commitments or promises too early, that could really end up being a huge, huge burden. And you don't want to be in a position where you have to say, oh, I told you I was going to pay your college tuition, but I realize now I can't do it. No one wants to be in that position. Of course, if it's the truth, then you're going to have to say it. You may have to back down a little bit. But let's try in advance to create a plan where we build helping children into the budget. Notice I'm using the word help, and I'm very careful about enabling, because I will tell you a problem that I see all the time, frequently, let's say, in my day job as a financial advisor. I see that people want to help their kids, but instead of helping them, they're giving them more and more money, and that's enabling the kids not to develop good financial habits. The people say, well, it's so hard in Israel for people to buy a home, so let me just buy a home for my kids. And then they buy a house for them that the parents can't afford and the kids can't afford to keep up. Or they say, well, I want to just make sure that my children are well taken care of, so I'll give them a stipend of $3,000 a month. All of a sudden, when this happens, $3,000 turns out to be enough for someone to pretty much live on. People who get that kind of money frequently, not sometimes or rarely, but frequently, lose their motivation to work. You have to make sure that if your kids are getting too much money, you're not actually enabling them to make mistakes. It's sometimes very difficult to see that from within, so make sure you get a little outside perspective. But certainly, if you feel that you're giving your kids too much, then absolutely you are, and that's a sign that you should stop. Let's focus a little bit more on estate planning now. Now, estate planning means planning on what you're going to do, not only in dealing with your husband's estate, but in your own estate in the future. One of the problems that comes up is people wonder, well, gee, should I give equally to everyone? And there that you find that there are a lot of concerns that people have, or they should have, but they don't. Let me give you an example. In certain cases, people are dealing with a child or a grandchild who has a disability. If there are special circumstances, then I think it's okay to not give equally. If some child needs money, not because he wants money or not because he's bad with money, but because there's some medical condition or psychological condition where he simply is not able to take care of himself, then you need to speak with a financial advisor and a lawyer who can specialize in special needs trusts, who can help you out to determine what you need to do. That would be the one case I can think of where you should be unfair. Other things you want to consider are equally distributing the money is fair, but not equally distributing the money. For example, giving more money to the kids who are poor than to the kids who are rich. Well, that's not fair. That's actually saying, that's punishing the ones who are more financially successful. You may say, no, but I want to support the one who decided to be an artist. Well, that's nice, but maybe he's not going to be making enough money. I understand there are pros and cons to this, but ultimately, you want to make sure that your children don't have hard feelings, either against you or against each other after you're gone. The best way to handle this is to be fair. Other things you want to do is begin to forgive. Sometimes people say, well, I gave this kid $1,000 or $5,000. Okay, it's time to move on. When you're making your will, think about what happened. If you bought a house for someone or helped one of the kids with a down payment, that would be something you want to reevaluate and reconsider and maybe say, I will distribute the money to all my other kids, taking into account the fact that we have to equal out the fact that one of the kids already got his down payment on his house. But other than that, don't try to weigh in emotional memories that could really hurt someone. And finally, hopefully you've trained your kids during their lifetime. You cannot control everything from the next world. It's time to say, listen, I've helped you, I've taught you, I've educated you, here's the money. You don't want to put too many conditions on. I'm not talking about a case where there's a kid who might have difficulty, meaning he'll get the money and he'll gamble it away, or there's a drug problem, or there's other circumstances that I would consider special circumstances. But you don't want to be the type of person who's going to try and control everything from the next world. It just doesn't work, and it creates hard feelings. There are certain documents that you're going to need. Now, people talk about all sorts of things, and there's a lot of legal speak, and people get nervous. The fact is, it's not too much. The number one document you need is either a will or a trust, or both. This is how you say what should happen to my assets when I die. And the will and the trust actually can work very similarly, but your lawyer can explain to you the difference in the pros and cons of each. Another really critical document is to have a power of attorney. Power of attorney says while you're alive, who should be able to handle affairs for you if you are either not interested or not able. Along with the power of attorney, you might want to go to your investment advisor or your bank and say, do you guys have a special form so I can assign my spouse or my brother or my friend or my lawyer in order to be able to have control of it? We do this in my own company at Profile Investments. Although people can come in with the power of attorney, it's much, much easier if they use our internal, it's called a trading authority document, which allows the client to assign someone else to be able to speak on the client's behalf. It just works simpler. It's a very simple document to handle, and we encourage clients to do that all the time. Another non-financial document is called a healthcare proxy, which just simply says what your healthcare wishes are. It is so important that you talk about your healthcare wishes. Don't leave it to chance, because you may have very specific interests and your kids may not know them, or they may disagree about what's important. And if that's the case, then you need to put something in writing. It's good to talk about it so over the years so people understand what your healthcare interests are. Are you looking for a do not resuscitation order? Do you want the doctors to do whatever they can to keep you alive? Do you want to donate organs? All of these things should be spoken about in advance so that no one has to guess. Next is you might want to include charity in your estate plan. I think, first of all, everyone should include charity as part of his or her daily living. Set the example while you're alive. Don't just make it something in death. And next, make it part of your overall financial plan so you can budget for it. You might also want to give a named charity if you're a widow and you want to set something up for your spouse. That's a very nice thing to do. You might want to leave a legacy by giving money in your will. This is something you can also say. You might say 20% of my estate should go to XYZ charity. That, by the way, has benefits in terms of taxes as well. You should speak to the development officer at the charity or your own tax advisor to see if this is relevant to you. Certainly, when you give money to a recognized charity during your lifetime, you have certain benefits in terms of taxes from that as well. And finally, listen, if you don't support the investments, if you don't support the organizations that are important to you, who will? This is the time to do it, and it's your last chance. You may want to really seriously consider doing it in your will or your trust, setting the example that charity is something that's important. We haven't spoken about any specific investments today, but it's important to realize that before you do any investing, make sure you speak with a licensed advisor. Today's discussion is just kind of in general, but I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have about your own situation. You can contact me by going to my website, profile-financial.com, or simply calling us at 02-624-2788. My name is Doug Goldstein. I am the Director of Profile Investment Services. I've been working in the investment world for over 25 years, and I specialize in working with people who live in Israel who have U.S. brokerage accounts or IRA accounts, or if they're receiving an inheritance from the United States. So if you're dealing with dollar investments and you live in Israel, I would be more than happy to talk to you. Thanks very much for taking the time to listen. Again, please feel free to contact us at profile-financial.com or 02-624-2788.